The art of self-reliance is forging your own path, but the path is difficult. Made easier by learning from those who have succeeded in directing their own lives on their own terms. With their help and inspiration, your path to self-reliance moves from dream to reality. And now, here's your host, Dr. Rodney King.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Art of Self-Reliance podcast. In this episode, I speak to Frank Sobczak. Frank is a PhD candidate in international relations at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He has also taught at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, Tufts University, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Military History from West Point and a Master's in Arab Studies from Georgetown University. During his 26-year career in the U.S. Army, he served in various Special Forces assignments, including leading teams in companies in the 5th Special Forces Group, in peace and in wartime, while representing U.S. Special Operations Command as a congressional liaison. In this episode, we discuss survival and contingency planning, the importance of being prepared, risk management, and putting it into practice.
The art of self-reliance calls you to adventure, to develop your self-protection skills, to learn how to survive no matter where you find yourself, and to thrive amongst life's chaos.
All right, so Frank, here's my first question for you. When you hear the word self-reliance, what does that mean to you?
So to me, the word self-reliance ultimately means that when push comes to shove, you are prepared, that you are ready kind of for any contingency, and that you've properly planned and considered ultimate possibilities so that you're ready to deal with it.
So that leads in nicely to what we said we were going to talk about. So let's hit on that first topic. Let's talk about contingency planning and the importance of being prepared.
Yeah. So to me, I served 26 years in the military, 22 of them in special forces. And, there's an adage in the U.S. military. It's called the 5 Ps. And you probably heard of it before. Probably the British military uses the same. And they stand for, prior planning prevents piss poor performance, which means you think about things before you jump into them. And in particular, within U.S. Army Special Forces, we do contingency planning. And of course, because everything has an acronym in the military, the acronym within U.S. Army Special Forces it's called PACE planning. And what that is it's you basically break it down into different options, kind of a primary, an alternate, a contingency, and an emergency. You have plans, multiple plans, so that if your primary plan falls apart, you've got an alternate plan. If that alternate plan falls apart, you've got a contingency plan. And then finally, if that contingency plan has even collapsed, you've got an emergency plan where that if everything else is, can I say hell? Okay. If everything else has gone to hell, that you've still got a plan that, you can survive on.
Always when I'm thinking about this is that oftentimes people that would be listening to this are not necessarily going to be coming from the military or law enforcement or have that kind of background. So I guess always the thing that's in the back of my mind is, how do we apply this? Like if I'm the everyday person, how am I going to apply this and where should I apply it? I mean, one of the most common things I always think about is when people are traveling, right? Is that people tend to travel all over the world, but they don't give it a second notice about, maybe where they're going to isn't a great spot, or maybe there are things on the ground that they should know about, but then they leave it to fortune and get on the ground and suddenly something happens and then they have no planning.
Yeah. So I think, ultimately to me, and again, we all are a product of our past. And so me, actually sum total, I spent 31 years in uniform, including my 4 years as a cadet. I actually did an exchange with RMA Sandhurst. I've done exchanges with 4th Brigade. So during that time, one of the things that they kind of taught us also was when to kind of apply this contingency planning is you can look at it kind of like from a risk assessment kind of perspective. and you look at it from the perspective of kind of two gauges. One gauge being, okay, how likely is this bad or dangerous event likely to happen? If it's kind of a low, kind of order of, feasibility of happening, then that adapts your planning. Now, the second gauge to kind of look at, and it's almost like you're looking at it like a scale, like a graph, because the two interact with one another. The other component is how dangerous is that event. So that if you have a low order, of happening event, but that event could be catastrophic, meaning like you're dead, you should probably plan for it. Whereas one of the events that is low priority of happening and then low injury, well, that's something you might not have to worry about. But ultimately, when you put those together, particularly if you're traveling, again, it does still move back to the kind of same original concept of prior planning. Know where you're going, do some research, and then kind of from there, then formulate a plan based on what are the most likely risks and the most dangerous risks that you're going to encounter.
I think for a lot of people, they just want to go away. If we're just talking, we use it as an example, right? I'm going on holiday. I just want to have fun. And in some sense, they think that takes a little bit of the fun away from it, that you kind of think in that way. And there's this, I guess, this gut reaction against the sense that, oh, I'm just being totally paranoid.
So I think there's ways to counter that. And what I do is I pack a go bag, even if I'm going with my family. And so that go bag, and it's not a go bag in terms of like I've got to evac an area, but it's like a bag that I'm taking with me on travel, like literally anywhere. And for example, with my kids, I have a small bag of all like over-the-counter meds that, and a thermometer, and like basic stuff that, if they're dehydrated or if they're throwing up or any other, event, it's already packed. Like I don't even have to like think about it. I grab the bag, I put it into my suitcase, and I'm done. And the same thing kind of with, my wife and myself is I have a small bag. And in this case, I have some prescription meds also kind of for everyone, particularly if I'm going somewhere within the developing world. I'll probably have some, either, antibiotic or other, kind of care available depending on, again, what is available locally, what have I planned for, what, when I did my research, what will I have to rely on myself?
So when you're thinking about, I kind of put them under this umbrella of primal skills, right? Things that people should be working on, should be developing. What comes to mind for you? Like, what are the skills that just, the everyday person should be spending some time on developing? As for myself, for example, my background specifically and what I'm most known for is in the defensive tactics world. So I'm a big advocate, of course, that people need to know how to use their body in a way to protect themselves, because it's something that you have with you all the time, which is your body. You don't need any equipment. You don't need anything else, but it's a primal skill, and it's something that needs to be developed just in case you do get into a situation that you are able to trust yourself in order to get yourself out of that bad spot.
For sure. So I agree with that also. And I would, for most people, and I think some people, could still definitely, I'd say the vast majority of people could benefit from hand-to-hand or, individual fighting technique skills, to be able to defend themselves, to be able to defend and protect others. I think there's great utility in that. That said, to be very blunt and honest, I think there's also a percentage of the population that probably that would have some limited skills in that area. Then there's also a percentage of the population that probably just won't go there, that they won't invest the time in it. At the lower level, I think the thing that a lot of people could grasp onto is, basic self-care and first aid. And those are things I think really that like literally anyone could do, right? I mean, you don't have to be able to do, a cricothytomy, like do crike someone, you like that's not necessary. but other basic skills, akin to like the Boy Scouts here in the United States, and I forget what it's called in the UK. Is it called Boy Scouts or is it called Scouts or something?
I think it's probably the Scouts. I'm
Yeah,
not really
I think
sure
it's called
because
Scouts.
I mean, I'm from South Africa, so
Oh, okay.
we still used to call it the
Sorry.
Boy Scouts,
Right.
right?
All right. So on those kind of general concepts, I think like basic first aid of akin to what's being taught in Scouts is something that I think has utility. Whether it's applying a field dressing, a pressor dressing, even tourniquets. I think you, the opportunities for injury are abound. And I'll give you just a couple occurrences. Knowing CPR is another one. I've had to perform CPR twice in my life in non-combat environments. Just once, I was on my honeymoon, and then the other time I was bike commuting, and saw someone who had collapsed. So having those basic skills of CPR, how to do some basic first aid, I think is really stuff that like literally anyone could do. Beyond that, I agree with you. I'm definitely a firm advocate in being able to defend yourself, with your, body.
Yeah, and I guess also maybe we can just expand that. So when I say defensive tactics, obviously I guess the extreme version of that would be me applying my physical skill sets. But there's all of the stuff that you were talking about, which is equally important. You talked about the 5 Ps, you talked about pace. Most people don't know that, and most people don't apply that. So one of the things that I would always advocate to people is that wherever possible, you don't actually want to get into a physical altercation with anybody. And if you can find a way out of it using verbal jiu-jitsu or just avoidance, right? That is a win in itself. But I guess for a lot of guys, that's really difficult, right? Because the ego kicks in and they kind of, the bravado, and they think that they have to engage with everybody that just looks at them wrong. And they don't really see that as moving away from violence and not engaging it in the first place is actually a greater victory. Because one of the things I tell people all the time, right? You get into a physical altercation with somebody, you have no idea where that's going to go to. So maybe I throw a punch, he picks up a bottle, I find a bladed weapon, he pulls out a firearm. One thing will just go from bad to worse, right? So it's not just, what I'm not advocating is I'm not just saying, okay, only the physical skill sets. There's also these other things that you've been talking about as well.
Yeah. So I totally agree 100%. And, I would throw out that, there's the old adage, never bring a knife to a gunfight. Never, go with your fists to a knife fight. Because just like you said, you have no idea where it will go. And I'm definitely huge in favor of, knowing kind of how to de-escalate a situation. There's training that's available for that. It's not hard. I agree with a lot of guys do have issues with it, but I really think it's something that you can train on, you can prepare on, and it's the much greater victory. I would throw also out that to loop back to kind of like the 5 Ps and contingency planning is that if you've done your homework, you can avoid, in many cases, either locations of potentially danger, where you're more, again, kind of on that scale of what is more likely to happen and what is more dangerous to happen. You can avoid locations where it is more dangerous to happen. You can avoid situations where it's more likely to happen. Whether it be, intoxication or late at night or, by yourself, the certain situations have much greater risk. And if you've planned properly to avoid those situations, you give yourselves a much less likelihood of having to, become physically involved in fighting.
Yeah, so Frank, I was just, as you were saying that, I want to get your take on this because I've talked to a few people about this, and I'm always interested because there's always some nuances that I pick up that somebody else might have not mentioned. What is your take on situational awareness? I think you will agree it's probably really important, but how would you define it, and how would you say a person can go about actually developing it?
Yeah, so there's two components to it, and I believe very much in situational awareness, and I believe that there are two elements to it. One is kind of like being actively aware of what your situation is and where you are and what's going on around you. And, it doesn't take 100% of your attention, but just always having, a percentage of your attention directed, almost like a radar. Like if you're on a surface warship, your radar is on active. It is, you are monitoring what's going on around you. And when something doesn't seem right, or when, your attention indicates something is going wrong, that's the second element that I think is important, is that your intuition, kind of to, draft into the Marvel comics, your spidey sense, when your intuition and that, cold feeling goes up your spine and your hair stands on end, learn to trust it, right? Because that's like millions of years of evolution, of winning the evolutionary battle, speaking to you, saying, hey, I want to survive. I want to continue to be part of the species that continues to promulgate. And learning to be in touch with that intuition and learning to trust it when something says, like, okay, should I go with this person or should I not go with this person? And something is the pit of your stomach or the back of your neck is saying, maybe not a good idea. Even though maybe that person is very attractive or very astute or very whatever, that intuition, it has served us very well as a species. And it's one of the reasons why we're pretty darn close, if not at the top of the food chain.
I noticed that a lot of people don't trust that intuition. And I'm wondering how much of the modern world that we live in, where we are no longer, interacting with our intuition on a daily basis, plays into that. If I think back to, the time when we were hunter-gatherers, which was pretty much for most of the time of the human race on the planet. I mean, this modern version of the world is a very, very small part of our history. We had to engage our intuition daily. And I think a lot of people are disconnected from it, right? They don't actually really trust it anymore, and they override it with their thinking, and they're like, oh, you're just being silly and you shouldn't be thinking that way about this particular person. One person said in an interview, they were talking about Gavin de Becker's book on fear, and where he was talking about intuition, and just having that ability when you have that sense of saying no to somebody can be very difficult because you don't want to offend them, right?
Yeah. So the modern world has actually, over probably the last, I would argue, 60 years or so, has really kind of gone kind of counter to evolution in some ways. And oddly, we've been kind of fortunate. I mean, I could pontificate on kind of some of the reasons why that has occurred. Well, I'll throw this out. I mean, this is going to sound very bizarre, but in most cases, we meaning, large segments of the world, we have avoided another global war like World War I, World War II, the Napoleonic conflicts, the Mongol hordes, global conflicts we have managed to avoid. And that pushes down the death toll. It pushes down the number of individuals who are put into a fight or flight, life or death situations. And it changes, it has an evolutionary impact in that, because we haven't, fortunately had to fight a conflict, some of those survival instincts are not as critical. And honestly, kind of in a Darwinistic sense, people who might have been killed live, and they, continue along with perhaps, fewer survival instincts. We kind of don't need them as much in the modern world. And, honestly, in many ways, that's great. But in some situations, it doesn't serve us well.
Just as you were saying that, I was thinking about this whole thing that we've been talking about contingency planning and all those elements. I think when people actually apply that, that's where they start opening themselves back up to that intuition, trusting, their spidey sense, as you noted. Because what it does is, and in my experience, is that you don't need to be paranoid about it. It just needs to be something that's in the background of your mind. You need to just be aware that that's required, and you don't know this environment, for example, that you're in, and it's important to take note of what's happening around you. But as you start doing that more and more and you get into a habit of doing that, that will improve your confidence, right?
Yeah. And it becomes second nature. And it's like anything, it's training. When you've trained yourself, you become more proficient at it, and it becomes easier, and therefore you notice things more clearly and easily. You don't have to spend as much time focusing on it. And so that intuition, again, it's like you said, there are, there's a long span of history that, it kept us from being eaten. And so it's still there. 60 years is not going to change that. And so consequently, all you have to do is kind of, it's like, you sharpen those skills, and they will come back in most cases.
So could you give us some examples of that? Like when when you're traveling around and just in your everyday life, outside of, you mentioned that you have, I don't know what you called it. It was like a bug out bag, but not really a bug out bag, but you have that, right?
Yeah.
What other things do you do? Just if we just think about the everyday things that people just take for granted, what would you say that you doing differently to say that just the normal person on the street?
If it's an everyday occurrence, like for example, driving to work, some of the situations, so I live in New England. It snows a lot here in the winter. It's cold. And, every year there are a number of people who spin their cars off on the side of the road and freeze to death before aid comes to them. Or who get stuck and, suffocate when their exhaust pipes have been, covered by snow after they've spun off the side of the road. So the things that I kind of, particularly in that kind of scenario, in general scenarios, I'll always have like a small solar blanket that folds up to about fist size. Again, it's like a small aid bag, okay, but a really small one. Like we're talking like 6 inches by 4 inches, where I've got some basics in there. I've got a space blanket, a solar blanket, that if there's a casualty or myself, that I can wrap myself into to prevent shock. I've got a little bit of water, a little bit of fluids, for hydration. If I've got to stay somewhere for a while. I've got a small first aid kit, a couple bandages of different types, a little bit of something to clean a wound, real basic stuff. If on the scenarios applied to the winter, in that case, I will also have a real blanket, like a full-blown blanket. In some cases, if I know that there's snow coming, I've got snow boots. I might even pack a shovel if I know that, for example, I've got to be somewhere, whether it be for military duty or, whatever. Those are the things I'll do, and those are kind of day-to-day, life here in New England.
So that's really good, because I guess what you're really saying is there, and again, it speaks back to everything you've been noting, is that you really need to know your environment, right? And I think that's important. Like, know what your environment is, even if it's just your local environment where you live. Know what you may have to encounter and have some pre-planning, because when shit hits the fan, then you don't have to think about it. And as we know, right, what people tend to do is when they're faced with something that puts them under threat, typically, if they haven't done any pre-planning or any training for it, they just freeze.
Or people panic, which is even worse. And oftentimes panic can lead to shock, which leads to health issues, and then you're in a death spiral. And so, ultimately, again, the first thing is that 5 Ps is: what is your local environment? What is the weather? And what are you going to have to contend with? If I was, for example, driving in the American Southwest, in parts of Texas, literally you have to plan your gas station to gas station. Because if you do not plan appropriately and you drive past the gas station, there's not another gas station for 60, 70 miles, or 100 kilometers or whatever. And you will be really out of luck if you fail to do that. So consequently, it's something that's really, really important to like understand. You know, there's a soft imperative. So as in Army Special Forces, we always used to say the first special operations imperative is understand your operational environment. That again, it's kind of linked to that five P's, right? And if your operational environment is you're going to be driving through the desert, well, you might want to have an extra jerry can of fuel. Definitely want to have water. You want to have some sort of potential shade that you're going to create for yourself if you've got to be somewhere for a while. And you're going to have a signaling device. And that's the other thing, actually, that I always bring with myself, a flare or whatever. You know, if your car breaks down and it literally is not going to go anywhere, you know, and you're stuck on the side of the road, or not even really on the side of the road where you're partially blocking traffic, you know, you want to have something that's going to signal at night that you're there, so that you don't get killed. So again, those all these elements of prior planning prevent your mind from going into panic. And when people are in panic mode, they don't think well, they don't process data, they don't process information, and it can be very dangerous.
And there's also something to be said for those baseline survival skills, like knowing how to make a shelter, how to start a fire. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because again, I think this always comes back to it when I'm talking to people or I'm teaching people. One of the things that I want them to do is to have confidence. When you have confidence, right, then you're in a much better position. And then even though you might be feeling this overwhelming fear or whatever it may be in that moment in time, you're going to be able to manage it more effectively.
Exactly. A lot of stress, you know, comes from uncertainty and unknown situations. And if you've been in that situation before and you've been able to light, you know, create a fire on your own multiple times, well, that's not uncertain. You've done it before. It's like, hey, you know, this isn't my first rodeo, you know, and I know how to do this. And so consequently, that really sets you up for success. So I'm also definitely a strong proponent of all those baseline skills. You know, again, I'll put a plug in for the Scouts, you know, Boy Scouts globally. And, you know, the Boy Scouts are, at least actually, I think globally, you know, they're taking young women into it also. You know, I have taught my daughter and my son how to light a fire, you know, with, you know, what they can find around them and a fire starter. Which is also kind of part of the kit that I bring everywhere. You know, a little bit of laundry lint, you know, soaked in Vaseline with that, and you can start a fire, you know, in a tropical monsoon almost. So definitely, those are skills I think really that everyone should have. And then, like, you know, literally, my 10-year-old son and 13-year-old daughter, they've practiced to do it.
Yeah, that's really good. Because I think like a lot of times, you know, people, they almost have this attitude that bad things are not going to happen to them. Or at least that's what I find in the more civilized, safer places of the planet. And what tends to come up quite a lot is, why do I need to change my behavior? It should be okay for me just to traverse the world as I want to, and nobody should interfere with me or want to cause me harm. But unfortunately and sadly, that is not how it is. And there are bad people in the world that would want to do bad things to you. And to have that kind of attitude of not wanting to change your behavior based on where you are, I think is a very dangerous mindset to have.
I agree very much also. And, you know, there are bad people everywhere. And, you know, in some ways, to me, that goes back to that same notion of, you know, much of the world has not had a catastrophic conflict in a long time. You know, if you, for example, you look at Europe, I mean, other than the Balkans, Europe has not had a conflict really since World War II, a major conflict. And that, I mean, it affects people's psyche, especially when it's been multiple generations. And it's like you said, they get lulled into the sense of bad things won't happen. And, you know, that's just, it's dangerous because, you know, oftentimes it doesn't even take someone else doing it to you. Frankly, you know, Mother Nature, and, you know, I recently did a sailing trip from South Florida to Massachusetts, a couple thousand miles. Mother Nature will kill you in a heartbeat and not even pause. Not even, no one will, there'll be a blip in history. So never screw with Mother Nature because Mother Nature will kill you deader than dead in a heartbeat.
Yeah. So when you did that trip, I would be interested to hear from you what actually came up. Like, what did Mother Nature throw at you, and what did you find that you had to contend with?
So there was really only two kind of instances that we had to contend with. So we were, and again, okay, so just the context, 36-foot sailboat. We were about 140 miles offshore. So for a small boat like that, it's not a huge deal, but it's for me, I'm gonna plan for something like that because even for a Coast Guard helicopter, from spin up, you've got to survive on your own for 2 or 3 hours at a minimum, and most likely 6 to 8. Um, so the things that got thrown at us, we had a storm. I mean, it was okay. We had, some of the crew members. So I had friends who had kind of come along. One crew member was sick, throwing up. He was actually doing pretty good though, because he had like planned. He had some meds to kind of like help offset it. So he was pretty squared away. We got bounced around a decent amount. One of the guys cracked a rib, or actually, correction, two ribs. And then just blind luck. So to put it into context, I'm an experienced sailor, but I'm not an experienced sailor who's going to be taking, like 4 or 5, 6 days offshore, where you're, 140 miles offshore. That's not in my comfort zone. So I actually hired a professional captain, who had 200,000 sailing miles to kind of captain the boat, to kind of tell us what to do, and to be able to it's like you talked about experience. Someone with 200,000 sailing miles has seen everything. It's your grizzled, war veteran who's been through 3 conflicts and seen everything twice. And so they've got this vast, reservoir of knowledge to kind of draw upon, when, like you said before, the shit hits the fan. Well, we were, I think we were like 100 miles offshore, and he started urinating blood, and kind of became incapacitated. And so we mostly had to take over, had to kind of make some decisions. I had also, again, prior planning prevents piss poor performance. I had you know, a very well developed first aid kit. I had IV fluids. I had an AED. I had everything, for tourniquets, burns, you name it. I had multiple meds. I also had multiple means of communication offshore, such as a satellite phone and a couple Garmin inReaches, which again, plug for them. They're pretty awesome because you can text with them via satellite. And they're all satellite capable, so you don't have to be within VHF or HF range. And I had a 24-hour number to a friend of mine who was a Special Forces medic, who are basically almost the equivalent of trauma surgeons. And I was able to call him up, and he answered on the second ring. And so we were kind of able to, in a situation that could have been highly stressful, we were able to get comms with someone because we had properly planned, and assess and make good decisions. And everyone ended up, we sailed into shore, and got people to the appropriate level of care.
So then after that, did you carry on with the trip? Because I mean, was that right in the beginning of the trip, right?
We did.
Okay.
So that was in North Carolina. It was about halfway up, and basically had to evacuate 2 members of the crew. That left us with 2 people. We were not in the best conditions, just with 2 people to kind of try to do a trip on our own. We did go one more day, and then we had some mechanical issues with the boat. And long story there. Um, but there's no such thing as a free boat, even when it's coming from your dad. Uh, and So we basically had to pause, had a new delivery captain come in. And my son, he was 18 then, flew in. And so my one other friend had to fly back, because he kind of ran out of time, on his vacation from work. And then so three of us continued on, from North Carolina to Massachusetts, that second half of the war.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, at least you made it to the end, right? What did it feel like once you got to the end after that?
It felt great. Like, it had been, pretty stressful. It's also, stress changes when you have people that you care very much, with you, or when you're in charge, or you feel like you're in charge, even if you're not the delivery captain, you're the owner in the boat. It's, everyone's counting on you to have made the right planning so that, when things go wrong, that everyone survives. And, these were Army buddies, some of them that I'd been to war with. And then, obviously my son was there for the second half of the voyage. And so, yeah.
That changes the dynamics for sure, as you noted. So one of the things I wanted to chat to you about a little bit off script was that I noticed that you're doing your PhD. So somebody that's just finished theirs recently, I'm always interested to speak to another. I don't know if you'd consider yourself an academic. I didn't consider myself an academic. I have an interesting story there, but that's a long one. But bottom line was I never finished high school. So it was kind of an interesting thing for me to go through that process. So one, I'm interested to know, what are you actually pursuing, and how far are you in, and how are you finding it?
Yeah. So, it's interesting. So I'm the first person on my dad's side to ever finish college. My dad, he used the GI Bill after World War II. He was drafted in World War II. He used the GI Bill. He didn't finish college. But in many ways, like, it's weird, the world has changed, and in some ways not for the better. Because, like, my dad, he did not have a college degree, but he ended up working for Stuart Warner as an electrical engineer without a degree, and he got 12 patents. And in the modern world, we've become so enamored with kind of bells and whistles and stamps and degrees and whatever, that sometimes I think we lose sight of what's really important. And so I guess, do I consider myself an academic, and what am I studying? So I'm studying international relations, specifically security studies. And I don't know. I guess I do. I've always been kind of a weird duck. So I've always, I'm always carrying a book somewhere where I'm going. Like, I was in Iraq as, company commander, commanding a couple special forces teams in Nineveh province in 2005. And, I'd go to meetings and I'd have a book that I was just reading, like a history book or academic book or whatever. And it was funny, like, my nickname, everyone gets nicknames in the military. And so my nickname was the Professor. It was funny, it was always, like, considered the smart one. So in our military, in special forces, you have to go to this school called Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. And part of it is you get, at the end of it, you get captured and you go through kind of a prisoner of war camp for a couple days. And in it, one of the kind of standard things that you always have to deal with is they put you're all war criminals, so they put you on trial. So they have to select a lawyer. So of course, they're like, okay, well, we're going to select, him to be he's going to be a war criminal. They're putting him on trial. And they're like, you must select a lawyer. So then everyone, like, looks around and kind of looks at me and is like, he's our lawyer. And so, just as a side note, you don't want me to defend you because I'm 0 for 1 and my client got executed, mock executed. Um, but so yeah, I guess I've always been kind of, in some ways, I'm weird because I I love to study. I love, to learn, to teach. It's fun. It's a passion. Um, and so in some ways, like within the, and special forces is very good to me, and it's much more intellectual than your kind of average Cro-Magnon, like military experience. But even in that, I didn't fit in quite perfectly because I was kind of like the smart one. And I probably shouldn't say that. I mean, but I think that's like how people would describe me. Then in academia, I don't really fit in either because with them, I'm this military guy with combat experience, been shot at, multiple concussions, hearing loss, like just messed, like 4 broken bones, contact sports, and they look at me like, I'm a Neanderthal. And, so it's weird, not really fitting in either place. But that's life. We make, we choose our pathways, and then we do the best we can.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a difficult path. I mean, there were lots of times where I was like, why the fucking hell am I doing this, man? It's like I'm putting myself through some serious torture here. So you were talking about always carrying a book with you. If I was, if somebody's listening to this, what books would you recommend? Like, what would be your let's say your top 3 books that you would say, these are must reads. These are 3 books that I got the most out of, like I took the most lessons away from.
So I'm a huge fan of George Orwell. I think 1984 and Animal Farm are especially prescient. I think he really understood the human character and human nature. And so I definitely recommend pretty much anything by Orwell to kind of understand humanity. And, and again, I guess that, that's why even in any scenarios, there's always there's that 2% of my attention that is like, okay, things look great, but okay, who knows? And so I would also, like, in terms of survival, this is going to sound really bizarre. And I would like almost never recommend like an army like manual. Like, I'm almost believing I'm like about to say this, but the U.S. Army Survival Manual is actually good because it's very practical. It's really down to earth, and it goes through shelters and fire starting and homemade weapons and homemade traps, and I mean, you name it, it's there. Signaling, it's a very much. It's not like a manual. It's like how to. It's very like nuts and bolts.
That sounds really good. So to end off, Frank, if you can give us some words of inspiration, if people listening to this, what is the one thing you'd want to leave them with?
The one thing I'd leave them with is you can do it. Like, everyone has it in them. Everyone has survival instinct. And if you plan properly, you can get through almost anything. There are amazing tales of survival of people with very little training who've managed to get through extremely perilous situations just because they've kind of thought through a little bit in advance and done just a little bit of preparation. It doesn't take a lot, and it goes a long way.
To learn more about the art of self-reliance, our virtual coaching service, online courses, and our retreats in Thailand, head over to Primal Skills. That's with a Z.com.